Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's event, The Good, the Bad, and the Missing, a conversation on the 2020 Defence Strategic Update. My name's Dave Kilcullen. I'm a professor at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, and I'm also part of our Future Operations Research Group. This event is being recorded, so if you want to watch later on the HAS website, you have the opportunity to do that, or to tell all your mates to check out this webinar. We're going to begin today with some remarks from the Commandant of the Australian Defence Force Academy, Commodore Peter Levy. Commodore Levy's had a very distinguished naval career, commanding two of the Royal Australian Navy's guided missile frigates, the Stuart and the Sydney, deploying twice to Iraq and once to the Solomon Islands, and commanding the search for the missing Malaysian Airlines flight MH370, as well as numerous other achievements for which he's been awarded a number of decorations. But I want to mention something that you won't find in his bio. He was a class ahead of me here at ADFA, graduating in the first graduating class in 1986. And as far as I know, he's the first graduate of ADFA to come back as Commandant. So in that sense, he really represents the coming of age of an idea that goes back to the 1970s and a long and beneficial partnership between the Department of Defence and the University of New South Wales, which has really shaped generations of Australian military leaders. So Commandant, welcome, welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Dave. And can I join Professor Kilcullen in thanking everyone dialing in today to discuss this very important topic. And I'd also like to thank Professor Shirley Scott from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences here at ADFA, and in fact the whole UNSW Canberra team for hosting this webinar. As many of you'd be aware, and Dave just alluded to, the relationship between Defence and UNSW goes back 35 years here at the ADFA site, which just dates me. But it goes back over 50 years if you count the time the university provided tertiary education to the Army and the Navy prior to that. And as we strive to build the intellectual edge in our people here at ADFA, the start they get here is really important, and UNSW has a long and proud history of being part of that. And so the Defence Strategic Update. I was fortunate enough to be in the audience when Prime Minister Morrison launched the update back in July. And at the time, I remember thinking it was one of the most forthright and open national security speeches I'd heard from a Prime Minister in a very long time. The update builds on the White Paper of 2016, which reaffirmed the fundamentally maritime strategy for Australia's security in the face of some increasingly powerful and assertive countries challenging the rules-based international order that served our country so well. But as the update itself states, Australia's strategic environment had deteriorated faster than even predicted in 2016. And the Prime Minister's speech mentioned a number of times the parallels between the global circumstances now and those of the 1930s, when the world was faced with an economic depression and growing major power competition. It should also not be lost on us that the global strategic centre of gravity is moving rapidly to Asia. The geographic isolation Australia had from many of the great power challenges in the 20th century is disappearing. Those challenges will now play out in our own backyard. The 2016 White Paper set equal focus on three core strategic objectives, including a stable rules-based global order. But the strategic update instead places a geographic priority on our immediate region, from the Northeast Indian Ocean through Southeast Asia and New Guinea, out to the Southwest Pacific, with three strategic objectives that I'm sure we're all familiar with: shape Australia's strategic environment, deter actions against Australia's interests, and respond with credible military force when required. Shape, deter, respond. Now, while it's not surprising that as things become more unpredictable, one focuses closer to home, we must remember that Australia has interests beyond our immediate region. A focus there does not mean that we should operate exclusively there. Distance and the need to project power and influence remain key attributes and key challenges for the ADF. I think it's also telling that the update and the associated funding increase to defence capabilities came at the height of the COVID pandemic, which had already placed tremendous pressures on the federal budget. And the new money's not insignificant. The strategic update commits an extra $75 billion for new capabilities over the next decade, compared with that committed to the decade after the Defence White Paper of 2016. The noticeable thing about the new military capabilities is the shift to a more offensive suite of options, long-range strike weapons and the like, designed to bolster the deter and the respond objectives. But we shouldn't just focus on the military hardware, of course. The supporting infrastructure, particularly in our north, the maturing of a sovereign defence industrial base and recognition of the fragility of supply lines, fuel and high-tech weapons in particular, and the increasing priority on regional allies are all just as important, as are the enabling space, cyber and C4I capabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot to unpack in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, and there's a fantastic panel of experts in various areas of national security ahead. So thank you again for being part of this important conversation, and I'll pass back to Dave now to move into our specialist speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a really great overview of some of the key points in the update. And as the Commandant noted, the update was developed over the course of a year with contributions from participants throughout Defence and across the government. But the question that we want to address today is how well does it actually deal with the fast-moving challenges of what most people recognise as one of the most dynamic and threatening environments in Australian history. So what's good, what's bad, and what's missing in the document? To help us answer those questions, as Commodore Levy mentioned, I'm delighted to be joined today by a really stellar panel of researchers, scholars, and public intellectuals in the fields of defence and strategy. Some of the speakers are members of our team here at UNSW Canberra. Others are experts on specific issues that are relevant as we seek to understand the update and put it in a broader context. And of course, that context includes what would have to be one of the craziest years in living memory, right? We started off with massive bushfires in January, February that damaged extensive areas in many states in Australia. Then in March, emanating from Wuhan in China, we had the coronavirus pandemic rapidly spreading worldwide, killing more than 1 million people so far, bringing lockdowns, economic shutdown to much of the world's economy, disruptions to trade and transportation, and increasingly confrontation between Australia and China. In April and May, Australia took an independent leadership role, bringing together a group of like-minded middle powers to hold China accountable for its actions and inactions with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, leading to trade tensions and pretty harsh rhetoric from Beijing. Then in June, we had the most extensive cyber attack on the Australian government in history, conducted by a state actor, which took down large parts of our parliamentary and governing apparatus for a brief period. Many experts attributed that attack to China as a retaliation for our assertiveness over COVID. At the same time, U.S. China tension, which was already very high, massively escalated with extreme rhetoric, a full-blown tech war, an acceleration in the decoupling of the American and Chinese economies, and now frequent standoffs at sea and in the air over the disputed South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and elsewhere. In September, China launched the final satellite in its new navigational constellation, rivaling the American GPS system. And both China and Russia, and just this week, North Korea, unveiled new and highly capable missile systems. As far as our supposed major ally is concerned, for much of the year, the US has been literally on fire, whether you're talking about bushfires in California or riots, arson, looting, deadly street violence, and massive political and social unrest on a scale unprecedented in US history. And of course, we're heading into the most violently disputed US presidential election in recent memory, just 3 weeks from now. So as we think about all that, we're going to hear a brief comment of about 5 minutes from each panelist. Then I'm going to pose a few questions to the group. And then we're going to throw the floor open for your comments and your questions, which you can submit using the Q&A function on the webinar. And as much as we have time to get to at the end of the discussion, we'll try to address the questions that come from the audience. So I encourage everyone to use that Q&A function. Although this is being recorded, as we mentioned, we won't out you. Any questions you ask will be anonymous. So feel free to be as controversial as I know some of our speakers are going to be. So to get us started, I'd like to welcome Ms. Cheryl Durant. She has over 30 years of experience in the national security sector, including specialist Army intelligence and defense capability and preparedness roles. In her former role as Director of Preparedness and Mobilization for the Department of Defense, Cheryl commissioned the first major review of defense mobilization that we've done since Vietnam, including supporting studies looking at the global supply chain vulnerability, cyber capabilities, and a whole host of other really important big picture strategic capabilities that empower the sorts of things that are talked about in the Defence Update. She's currently a fellow of the Institute for Integrated Economic Research in Australia and a climate counsellor. So Cheryl, thank you so much for being willing to join us today, and the floor is yours for your opening comments.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the University of New South Wales for the invite to be here on this panel today. I'd just like first to acknowledge the Palawa people of Tasmania, where I'm joining you via Zoom today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. But let's hoe in the good, the bad and the missing. So what's good in this Defence Strategic Update? And I was encouraged firstly by the continuing prominence given to information, cyber, space and intelligence capabilities. If we're believing the logic that says that the future of warfare is increasingly grey zone and hybrid warfare, these are the capabilities we're going to need for the information age. And this just continues, I think, investment in those capabilities and strengthens it going forward. The other good thing, and no surprise, is that this white paper's finally realised that supply chains matter, or at least it says so. Very surprising announcement, given that they've probably mattered for the last 4,000 years of warfare, but at least the fact that the ADF doesn't fight wars by itself, but needs supply chains and needs a national support base is given greater prominence. So it's really hard to unpick the funding behind that statement. The bad news is that actually these trends have been self-evident for several decades, some as early as the last part of last century. So in responding to them in this Defence Strategic Update, we're really looking still in the rearview mirror. These are things that have been self-evident for a while. It's good to see we're doing something about them now, once the blinding obviousness of supply chains has been smashed in our face by COVID-19. But we need to get a bit ahead of the game instead of constantly reacting to the rearview mirror. So it's a glass sort of half full there. So for me, what's really missing in this Defence Strategic Update is simple: foresight. Where's the future in this? This is still describing the strategic environment of the last decade or 2 decades. So where's the future in our future update? And this is particularly important because, as those listening will know, defence capability acquisitions are not measured in sort of minutes and hours and days. They tend to take years and last decades. So investment now needs to be really thinking about the world in 2030 plus. And for me, there are lots of missing big global drivers that the white paper hasn't really, or the strategic update hasn't got into. I'll name 3 in the time I've got. First is climate change. It's hidden there. It's hidden there as a sub-paragraph of a sub-paragraph. But in reality, climate change has moved on in the forward-thinking militaries of the world. It's no longer a threat multiplier. It's an existential risk in its own right. So it doesn't require a little bit of resilience, a little bit more things for disasters. It really potentially changes everything geostrategically. And just simply think of those mid-latitude countries, those fed by the Tibetan water tower, Pakistan, India, Taiwan, Malaysia, China. They're all going to have some food and water problems heading forward. That's presumably their lands remain habitable for humans, given the wet heat bulb temperatures that those places will experience. And that's going to change a little bit more than some fragility of countries in Africa and the Indo-Pacific. Twinned with that is it's a massive shift in energy happening. We're moving away from the refined fossil fuels that Australia no longer produces to a world which is increasingly investing in renewables. What does that mean for Australia's militaries going forward? The white paper or the update is silent on that. It's also silent on the fact that there's also an energy transition in military capabilities, away from those needed to power planes and tanks and ships to those needed to power satellites and data centres and other information capabilities. And again, we're silent on this, a massive opportunity missed, because Australia is potentially a world-leading superpower on the technologies of renewable energy and solar energy. It's not on refined fuels. We don't, so why continue with the vulnerability we already have? And finally, because my 5 minutes will be running to a close, is last time I checked, we had 3 oceans, not 2. There's an Indian, there's a Pacific, there's an Antarctic, and we're completely silent on the Antarctic in this Defence Strategic Update, despite the fact that the trend of climate change is pushing resources to the poles. And certainly there's increased interest in China and other nations on what's happening south of us. So I think that's another obvious part. So for me, just in conclusion, this leads us to an ugly place, one where we're once again preparing for the past instead of the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Cheryl. So supply chains matter. We're catching up. We're coming from behind, looking in the rearview mirror, lacking foresight, missing some big global drivers like climate change, energy transition. And then the really big point, which I couldn't agree with more, is the need to focus on the Southern Ocean and the Antarctic dimension, which is increasingly mirroring what's going on in the Arctic, right? As climate change really shifts the geopolitical foundations of a lot of what us and China in particular is thinking about. So to talk about China, we're very fortunate to have Associate Professor Jian Zhang, who's the Deputy Head for Education here in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. He's also the co-convener of the Asia Pacific Development and Security Research Group, one of the sister research groups to my Future Operations Group. And his primary research interests are China's foreign and security policy. He's published very extensively on Chinese capability development and on Chinese military affairs and Australian and Chinese relations. Professor Zhang, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. And it's a great pleasure and actually honor to join the other distinguished member of the panel and to talk about this very important issue. And so, as Dave said, this is a very important document and published in a very unusual time and among in the midst of unprecedented pandemic crisis and escalated U.S. China confrontation. So my comment will be focused on U.S. China confrontation and the strategic confrontation. So what I'm going to do is that I will be briefly talk about some of the key takeaway of mine from the update, and then I will be talking about 2 issues which I think which are missing from the document, which are related to China and related to U.S. China strategic confrontation. As a usual, disclaimer and all the the view expressed here are my own, and it doesn't represent the university or the school. Okay, so briefly, some of the key takeaway from that update. The update has assessed that Australia's strategic environment has worsened at a pace faster than what was anticipated a few years ago when the 2006 Defense White Paper was released. And the region became more dangerous and more complicated. And the fundamental driver of this change and of Australia's strategic environment is escalated U.S.-China confrontation. There are a list of other drivers listed in the document, but the document assessed the principal driver of the changing strategic environment for Australia is the U.S.-China strategic confrontation. So in response, the update proposed the new defense policy framework and focus on, well, firstly, it's focused on the immediate region, which just mentioned by the Commandant. And also the update lists 3 objectives for Australia defense policy. The first one is to shape the strategic environment for Australia. The second is to deter actions against Australia's interest. The third one is to respond, and with credible military forces if required. So these are all the very sensible and very good assessment. And so I have no issue with all this. I think the region and Australia's strategic environment are getting increasingly dangerous, complicated, and it's good for Australia to focus on a clear region, and also it's good for Australia to have a clear idea about around the 3 lines of shape, deter, and respond. So I would like to raise, however, by reading the document, I would like to raise 2 issues which I think that could be more addressed by the document or it's missing from the document. The first one is about how to shape Australia's strategic environment, and or to shape what? The list of action within the section on the shape of Australia's strategic environment largely based on the consideration that U.S. China competition is a given. It cannot be fixed. It's demonstrated a fatalistic view about the region's future. And so in that case, all the action listed in that section is about how to take action to protect Australia's interests like greater security, cooperation, capability development, intelligence sharing with the US and like-minded countries, etc. But I think this is all the important action to shape Australia's strategic environment. But there is little mention about what Australia can do and should do to manage, to influence, or to moderate the US-China strategic competition. And the document gives a larger view that strategic competition is a given. It's nothing Australia can do. And so all the action listed is to respond to that given strategic environment. But I think because if the fundamental driver of the deteriorating strategic environment of Australia is the US-China competition, then the first thing for Australia to shape its strategic environment is try to moderate and try to think how to deal with that issue. So that is the first thing I think the update could be think more and or it's missing from the document. The second issue is about the gray zone activity. The gray zone activity is one of the most mentioned term in the new strategic document. And that is also one of the key challenges faced by Australia. But the document defined gray zone activity as activity which undermining or coerce other country and in ways that avoid outright military conflict. And that's a range of examples about what are the gray zone activity are in the document. But having said that, there is very little in the document in terms of the section to deter actions which undermine Australia's interest. There is very little and to say how the developed capability are suitable for dealing with the list of gray zone activity listed in the document. And also there is one statement in that section is that the proposed defense capability and should be able to prevent gray zone activity from escalating into military conflict. But that is a misfocus in my view, because the very challenge of gray zone activity is that it undermines Australia's interest, but without causing a military conflict. So how to deal with those gray zone activity and in the situation without outright military conflict is actually a new challenge. But the focus of the update is that to develop capability to prevent those activities escalating into military conflict, then what that leads a question about what then the Australia should do to deal with the gray zone activity before it escalated into outright military conflict. So I think those issues perhaps could be more addressed in the document, and I will be stopping here. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So more dangerous, more complicated. The fundamental driver is US China strategic competition. The basic framework of shape, deter, respond is fine, but to shape how and to shape what. And I like your point that, you know, we're making the assumption that US China competition, possibly even military competition, is a given, can't be fixed, and little mention about how to manage, influence, or moderate that competition. And in fact, as we know, some people have been making the point recently that the most important goal of Australian statecraft in the next generation should in fact be to prevent a war between the US and China. And then you made a great point about grey zone activity and deterring grey zone. If we're building capabilities to stop grey zone activity from escalating to open conflict, that sort of ignores the fact that grey zone is specifically designed to avoid open conflict. So maybe the adversary isn't trying to escalate, they're trying to stay below the threshold. So how do we build those capabilities to deal with that? You talked a little bit about the maritime environment, and that is a key part of the change to a more complicated and more threatening environment. So to talk about that, I'd like to welcome Adjunct Professor and Rear Admiral Jim Goldrick, a former Commandant of the Academy, sea service extensively around the world, commanded HMAS Cessnock and the Sydney twice, commanded the multinational maritime interception force in the Persian Gulf, which the Americans call the Arabian Gulf, and also commanded Australia's Interagency Border Protection Command. So really familiar with a lot of the issues we've been talking about. So Jim, over to you for your initial comments.
Thanks, Dave. And it's an honour to be part of this panel. I'm going to start with a bad point about the paper, because I think it's come clear in the remarks already made, and it really does apply to the maritime challenge, is that a lot of the deficiencies that have already been mentioned and that I'm going to talk about, I really think reflect the fact that this defence effort is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We lack a national security strategy, and a lot of the questions that have been raised already, I think, would be much more effectively dealt with had they been couched on a whole of nation basis in the true sense, rather than in the specifics as mentioned in the strategic update, and approached in that way. And for example, the lack of mention of the Southern Ocean. I think it's a strength of the paper that it really does try to have this focus on what they now call the immediate region of Northeast Indian Ocean, mainland and maritime Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific. But the Southern Ocean is forgotten about. The Antarctic is specifically mentioned only indirectly, really, in relation to the development of an ice-strengthened ship capability in future construction. And that's the difficulty, because it's not showing, it is really following up what the paper's saying about really needing to span the spectrum to deal with the maritime in all its aspects. And one point that I would make is that if you actually add the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic and other areas of maritime interest to this area of direct of the immediate region as defined, you're probably thinking about still 20% of the Earth's surface. It's a big challenge. I think other strengths of the paper are the removal of the 10-year warning time, although I want to talk about some aspects of that, and also this enunciation of the need to develop independent capability in addition to maintaining and developing partnerships. And the recognition that that independent capability needs the ability to deliver deterrent effects, in other words, to reach out and touch people. And I think those are strengths. I think also the extent to which there's this investment being planned on supporting elements which will allow us to have a much better awareness, allow us to command and control better, I think that's all good. But there are fundamental problems. And I get back to this issue of not really expressing a whole of nation national security approach. One specific, and I would say this as a former Border Protection Commander, what's now Maritime Border Command, that remains world's best practice as an operational construct. But what the paper doesn't say is how the civil maritime capability needs to develop. And that to me is a real problem. I have a view it's increasingly underdone. It's been not well handled by Home Affairs, and it's raised, train and sustain elements. And I think we have a lot of questions about what the future relationship is and what the investments should be. And I think it's important that those investments are recognised as what they are, which is in the civil sphere, in addition to the defence sphere. And there really is insufficient mention of that. I think also, although the 10-year warning time has been removed, I'm not sure the paper, although it says some things, and Cheryl really was reflecting this, I'm not sure it's going to move, the programs will move fast enough to meet the challenges. One obvious element is, will the capability acquisition programs in terms of platforms and major systems be fast enough? But I actually want to really hone in on what Cheryl's saying about this preparedness element and the mobilisation element. And I really think that there's an open question, and this really does apply to our maritime capabilities. Are we going to ensure that we remove the hollowness, we improve resilience, we have the reserves of weapons, of spares, of fuel, which may be needed at very short notice? And this I think is an open question. Finally, I think that the need for partnerships is mentioned frequently in the update, and I think it's good also that it does try to reflect that the partnerships are more than military partnerships; they're more than naval partnerships. But I think we need to be. I think this challenge, and indeed, I gather Hugh White has just started talking about the challenge of having the high-level partnerships with countries like Japan and India. I think that more needs to be said about how we're going to do that, what our priorities are, and how this can work out in the maritime domain. But finally, I just get back to this problem that I see the strategic update is inherently an insufficient effort if it doesn't have behind it this look at the whole problem we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So it's necessary but not sufficient. We need a national strategy within which all these issues can be located, as Cheryl mentioned earlier. Emphasis on the Southern Ocean, again, this sort of three ocean dynamic, Pacific, Indian and Southern in Australian strategic history. The removal of the 10-year warning time, absolutely long overdue to see that removed. And this goes back to Cheryl's point about foresight earlier. The idea of independent capability for deterrence. I'm going to come back to that because an American friend asked me last week, is that code for nukes? So I think we should talk about that at some point and see what do we really mean by that. We need a whole nation approach to national security that locates, energy, industrial base, supply chain management, possibly education and other issues within that. And then the great point about preparedness and mobilization. So with that, along with the maritime, air, space and missile defense are pretty key areas of focus for the update. But as our next speaker is going to emphasize, there's also some pretty significant and you might say questionable assumptions that underpin the update. So again, we're lucky to have Air Vice Marshal retired John Blackburn. He's retired from Royal Australian Air Force in 2008 as the Deputy Chief of the Air Force. He was an F-18 fighter pilot, a test pilot, a strategic planner. He's made major contributions to thinking about missile defense, but also to things like building a viable talent pool in the national security space and integrating that with a whole of nation approach. So John or JB, over to you.
Dave, I'm sorry I just got cut off then. You just handed to me. I'm going to talk about assumptions. Trying to predict the future, or plan for the future, is very hard. And you need to make a series of assumptions in order to plan ahead. Now, we're in the midst of a pandemic, impending global financial crisis, and a rapidly deteriorating regional security environment. So in these very complicated circumstances, it pays to make our assumptions explicit, but we rarely do it. When we saw the defence budget come out, or the national budget come out last week, there's a lot of discussions about the short-term assumptions in there. I'm going to focus on the Defence Strategic Update assumptions and ask what was the government assuming. So I'm going to discuss 4 areas, the first of which, the first assumption, is that a national security strategy is not needed. So to pick up what James was talking about, in the current environment, it really is astounding that a strategy for a single component of national power is updated by itself. Now, Senator Jim Molan came out straight after that update and said, look, what we should be doing as a first step is to take a strategic view, to develop not just a disembodied defence strategy or cyber strategy or field strategy. These are all second-order issues. What we should be doing is preparing for what's coming with the hope of deterring conflict. And you've got to start with a national security strategy. Only then can we direct economic, financial, social and military preparations for conflict, preparing or to avoid them preferably. Now, as has been highlighted, we don't have a national security strategy. We did have one in 2013 under the Gillard government, but the Abbott government disposed of it, as it did with many other initiatives of the preceding government. So much for a bipartisan view on security. The second assumption I want to raise that I think is in there is the US alliance is fundamentally unchanging. We need to recalibrate the US-Australian alliance in this new strategic area. The behaviour of the US administration alone is cause enough for this recalibration even before we add in the deterioration in the regional security environment. Eric Brewer from the CSIS in October the 1st came out with a very interesting article saying that President Trump's America First approach to foreign policy, his hostility to what he refers to as so-called allies, and his embrace of the very dictators that the US alliances are designed to defend against, is leading to allies and partners across the globe to wonder whether Washington can no longer be counted on. It should not come as a shock, he said, if a US ally or partner were to determine today that it needed to launch or relaunch its own efforts to develop nuclear weapons or the capability to rapidly build them. If we could no longer convince ourselves of the reliability of the US administration, it would certainly undermine a raft of assumptions that we've held for decades and could result in some significant changes in our national security strategy, of course, if we had one. As was mentioned a little bit earlier, Hugh White's come out today with an interesting statement, an article, where he talks about this concern that Australia can't really rely on a coalition of regional alliances to counter China's ambitions and underpinning security. He said it's very risky to say that we could look to such an alliance of neighbours led by the US. And he also discusses the likely event that that Washington steps back from any major role in Asia, compounding the problem. The third assumption I want to talk about is economic. The DSU states there is an ongoing commitment to providing funding certainty for defence and that the defence budget has been decoupled from the GDP to forecasts to avoid us having to adjust defence's plans in response to future fluctuations in GDP. However, if economic problems continue to grow, and that is a realistic expectation or assumption, defence will come under intense pressure to make reductions. Now, one factor that's not clearly stated is about in the longer term, what's the assumed national economic growth that underpins this commitment to defence funding. I raise this because back in November 2016, the ADF's Future Operating Environment Assessment included the following statement, and this was basically a direction for finance. A combination of global population growth and increases in productivity is likely to see an average world GDP growth of 3.5% per annum in the years to 2035. At the time I questioned it, I was working as a reservist at that time. I said, hang on, what's your risk analysis here? We've got a long-term commitment to equipment acquisition. What happens if we see stagnation or a depression? Well, basically the answer that I got was, don't worry about it. That's the assumption we've been directed. Defence white paper projections and budget estimates have had a history of being somewhat flawed and lacking in transparency. So here we are in 2020. Are we to assume that in the midst of a pandemic, an emerging financial crisis, that the government will assure absolute defence funding levels? That is a brave assumption. So what national economic performance is this predicated on? Because the budget doesn't have long-term performance. How can it? It's such a confused and rapidly changing environment. The final area that I want to highlight is national infrastructure and supply chain assumptions. Now, in the past, Defence has recognised the risk of supply chain deficiencies and accepted them in the white papers. So the recent deterioration in the strategic environment has led to a shift in Defence's position, which now stresses the need for more secure supply chains. That's great to see that stated, but the big issue is in order to do what? It remains to be seen whether this will lead to any action to address supply chain vulnerabilities. After all, Defence is very limited in its ability to take substantial action without an integrated national effort. So if we're going to look at that and the dependencies that Defence has on national infrastructure, how about the self-reliance of the nation overall? In relation to supply chains, we've seen a lot of shocks during the pandemic. What is it we're assuming about that supply chain? Because it's largely left to the market. Defence now says it will increase the range and quantity of weapon stocks. Well, we've been arguing that one for decades. Funding has also been allocated for exploring and potentially implementing additional measures, including ADF fuel storage capacity being expanded. Well, that sounds like a bit of a delaying measure. We know that we have insufficient capacity in this country. We don't meet IEA stock holding standards. The stocks we have are less than 3 weeks. And of course, don't forget, we import 90% of our fuels, and 100% of those imported fuels come to Australia in foreign-owned or foreign-flagged ships. If the recent government measure to subsidise refineries to keep the remaining 4 refineries alive fail, we could become 100% import dependent. So think about those submarines and the diesel. Where is it coming from in a crisis? Bottom line, a national security strategy for the nation is needed to proceed and then incorporate a defence strategy update. The fact that we don't have a national security strategy means that this strategy update lacks a context and therefore is inadequate. Personally, I conclude that the release of the update 3 days before a federal by-election was not coincidental. In my view, that was political. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, JB. So I'm going to summarise your remarks as what were we thinking, right? And the idea of explicit assumptions, why update strategy for a single element of national power only, the need to recalibrate the US alliance. And I would even say it's not necessarily dependent on Trump. This is something that will be enduring when he leaves. I know you think that as well. So it's all sort of the question of, can we count on the Americans? Could we ever? And shocks and surprises, and making sure that our economic assumptions and our other assumptions are actually, let's call them future-proofed to the kinds of shocks that we might see. You mentioned supply chain vulnerability, and again, the third speaker to mention that, and I think it's a critical point. And one of the things that jumps out to me from that is that just because we recognize something as a national security issue, it's not immediately clear that defense is going to have the lead role or be given the lead role by other agencies in dealing with that. So there's again, back to your I think your macro point, that we need to have a national security strategy that we locate all of this within. So we've talked a lot about China and about regional reaction. One of the most important actors in the Asia Pacific, and one of Australia's most important defense partners, is Japan. And Japan's been dealing with many of the same issues with respect to the US and China as we have been dealing with. So to help us understand that Japanese perspective, our final panelist is Professor Aurelia George-Mulligan, who's a conjoint professor here at UNSW Canberra in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Her research and publications touch on many aspects of Japanese politics, political economy, and security. And she's one of the few real Japan experts out there in the Australian environment. We're super lucky to have her as our concluding speaker. So Aurelia, over to you.
Many thanks, Dave, for the introduction and invitation to talk to the group today, and particularly to speak about how Japan figures in the update and how the update was received in Japan. So we've had the missing, we've had the bad, so maybe it's time we spoke about the good, at least from the Japanese perspective. So how does Japan figure in the update? Well, it's explicitly mentioned in the foreword, where the Australian government commits to strengthened international engagement, to use their words, And it's also mentioned several times in Chapter 2 on defence policy. It's named as an important partner, in quotes, alongside which defence will continue to work to strengthen defence and diplomatic ties with countries in Australia's immediate region. Our special strategic partnership is also mentioned. It's described as one of the ways in which Australia engages with bilateral partners to support shared interests in global rules and norms, which are very close to Japan's heart. Japan is also noted as a participant in the trilateral strategic dialogue alongside the United States in addressing common strategic issues. And lastly, Japan is also nominated as a partner with which Australia will continue to prioritise engagement and defence relations, given that Japan's active role in the region is vital to regional security and stability. Well, how was the update received in Japan? There appears to be no public commentary in Japanese on the update, at least that I could find, just a couple of factual reports. Of course, there will have been private commentary in government and in government circles, and I'm sure that the Defence Attaché here in Canberra, if not the Ambassador Takahashi, who's an enthusiast for closer bilateral defence ties, will have reported back to the MOD, the Ministry of Defence in Tokyo. And if you were to ask an official of that ministry what they thought of the update and about the implications of the update for Japan, he or she, more likely he, would have been encouraged and reassured by the policy statements and capability commitments announced under the plan. There's no doubt that Japan welcomes a more military capable Australia, particularly one that can project power further from its shores, and also an Australia more committed to regional military engagement with security partners and its treaty ally, the United States. The update also affirms Australia's willingness to be an active and vocal advocate for a rules-based international order, which is particularly important to Japan. And clearly, Australia will be a partner that shares many of the same strategic interests and is committed to increased regional engagement. So all of this fits very nicely with the hedging strategy adopted by former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, to which new Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide is also committed. This is a strategy that hedges against any decline in the US commitment to defend Japan and the liberal international order by expanding Japan's own defence and deterrence power, as well as its contribution to the alliance, at the same time as multiplying its security partnerships across the region. Certainly, Prime Minister Abe expressed his strong support for the update in a teleconference with Prime Minister Morrison in July. The specifics of that conversation have not been reported, but overall, Japan's assessment of the update would have been very positive, given the extent to which the update aligns with Japan's own security and foreign policies and priorities. Just a couple of additional points too. Although the update wasn't mentioned explicitly in the new Japanese Defence White Paper, which was issued 2 weeks after our update, it was issued on the 14th of July, Australia certainly was mentioned in this document. The White Paper outlines Japan's national security strategy and lists Australia along with South Korea, the ASEAN countries and India under the heading, and in inverted commas, strengthening diplomacy and security cooperation with Japan's partners for peace and stability in the international community. So under this heading, the paper discusses something called enhancing cooperative relations with these countries. But we should always keep things in perspective. So when it comes to the 3 pillars of Japan's defence, which are also outlined in the paper, security cooperation, the category in which we belong, it's down the list at number 3. It comes after Japan's own architecture for national defence is number 1, and the US-Japan Security Alliance is number 2. So this gives us an idea of where we figure, relatively speaking, in Japan's list of defence policy imperatives. However, and this is my last point, it's worth noting that Japan's 2018 National Defence Programme guidelines refer to Australia as second only to our formal ally, the United States, in terms of its strategic importance to Japan. There's no doubt that since the upgrading of our relationship with Japan to the Special Strategic Partnership in 2014, our military-to-military ties and our border security links have expanded considerably. And the update will push this process even further. In fact, the pace of developments affirming the direction for the AJ defence relationship laid out in the update has been fast. And there are a number of developments that I could talk about, but I don't think I have time right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Aurelia. That was great. So special strategic partnership, end of an era with Abe stepping down. The Japanese thinking about hedging against US decline. We might put an asterisk against that and wonder whether it's a possible future outcome or something that's happening right now, as some other speakers have suggested. And this notion of enhancing cooperative relations with partners and our partnership with Japan being second only to Japan's partnership with the US. So we've got about 40 minutes left or so. I'm sorry, about 25 minutes left. And I would really want to encourage people to start getting questions into the Q&A so that we can address them. Before we get to those, I've got a few questions for the panel as a group. So Cheryl and JB, both of you mentioned, and others did too, the need for a national security strategy, one that focuses on industrial mobilization, energy supply chain, those kinds of things. Who do you see as the primary drivers in writing that strategy, and how do we make that happen from your standpoint? Maybe Cheryl, you'd like to start?
Yeah, so I think James, JB and myself are in agreement of the need for the national context. And I think it's really critical, and my learnings from having done the mobilisation piece with Engineers Australia, is how little we as a Department of Defence, and indeed how little government agencies knew about supply chains, because they're outsourced to the market. So for me, at least, one of the groups that definitely needs to be part of the process is those companies and businesses involved in supply chain. We need that expertise from outside. There is no, obviously Prime Minister and Cabinet would be a lead agency, but also I think Defence needs to develop its own strategic view on supply chains, which it hasn't really done. And it needs to bring that across government, which it hasn't really done. So we need the internal expertise as well.
And JB, do you think that would extend to the industrial base and energy supply as well? I mean, it sounds from your remarks like you do think that, yeah?
Absolutely. I think the very first thing to start with is what is national security. So if you go to the government's website, defence, counter-terrorism, border protection, and cyber. And that's the mentality we've got, instead of saying it's the whole of nation capabilities. And I've said this to a few defence audiences. When people say, oh, we've got a crisis, we'll just go and take the fuel supply that's down the civilian thing and off we'll go. And going, if our job is to look after our nation's security and well-being, the idea that in a crisis you'll just take it out of the civilian supply chain because you haven't prepared and analysed it, not a really good idea. Because our job is to protect the whole of our society, not let them starve whilst we all shoot off. I think the other problem is that's first is the definition. Secondly, where do you put it? I wouldn't even put it in PMC, because my interaction with PMC shows that they're frankly very stovepiped as well. So with the industrial age business model we got across government, all separate ministers, all separate departments, ideally PMC you would think could bring it together, but my experience in dealing with them is no, they're stovepiped internally. You almost need an acceptance that you have an area, not just a national security advisor, but national security area within the Prime Minister's own office. It's that big an issue, because to address this, you're going to have to change the way government works. You can't possibly address this in a stovepipe departmental model. It's like defence, when we were hundreds of projects and the first principles review said, let's put a program design layer across. Well, 5 years after the first principle review, we haven't done that. Put that aside for a moment. We need to do the same thing for national security across the government. But first thing is, let's have a conversation about what it's actually about.
Yeah, that's a great point. Jim, would you like to chime in on that? Or you brought up a couple of things about the national security elements of this as well.
I would. I certainly take John's point. I have to say that I do think there needs to be change in arrangements and outlooks. My view is it could rest with PM&C if PM&C had the right outlook. What I also think is there needs to be a conversation about resilience and the minimum. I would also say that we probably need to remove all the economic rationalists who are in the various departments. One seen some encouraging indications that their influence is being reduced. But for example, just specifics, how much fertilizer do we need to grow enough to feed people? How much fuel do we need to, again, run the system so that people can be fed? It's actually understanding what's the minimum necessary and planning for that. It can be done. It actually has been done. And Cheryl could probably comment on some of the historical studies done about mobilisation. But I think by the late stages of World War II, Western nations had pretty sophisticated machinery and also educated operators, policymakers, politicians and so on, in how whole of government really worked to deal with whole of nation problems. It wasn't perfect, but again, it can actually happen. And I suppose I get back to what's implicit in JB's point is outlooks need to change and stovepipes need to be removed.
Yeah. And while I've got you, I have to ask on behalf of just asking for a friend, right? What does independent deterrent capability mean? Is it code for nukes?
Well, in fact, strike was always a word that confused the Americans. I've had that on repeated occasions, and there's always a danger with an Australian capability. It's a bit like the Australian farmer with the Yorkshire sheep, what are their names?
Right.
Scale, what is the scale you're doing? And I think that's the great challenge. I think deterrence is a contextual thing. What Australia wants is to have sufficient deterrent force that nobody's going to try and mess with us if we're minding our own business. To sum it up. And of course, people either have to come to us or they have to cut us off from our supplies. Those are really the two ways that you get in Australia. The cutting off from supplies is both the more, is the somewhat more complex one, but also the more difficult to respond to. I'm not quite sure how you create a deterrent effect to prevent people cutting off your supplies unless you're actually in a serious alliance and partnership arrangement with other like-minded countries who won't accept that being done to you.
And this really gets back to John's point earlier about grey zone deterrence, right? In that, you don't necessarily need to have a task group appear in the so-called sea air gap off of Northern Australia in order to do very serious damage to Australia. You can be cutting off the 93,000 miles of fibre optic cable that we need to run the Australian economy, or you can be interdicting fuel supplies thousands of miles from the Australian coast. John, in addition to talking about that question of deterrence that we just brought up, can I ask you to just expand a little bit on your really, I thought, most powerful observation about we are taking as a given that there is going to be a war or a military confrontation between China and the US, and there's really nothing we can do about that. We just have to live with it and orient ourselves to that. And Aurelia, I might ask you to chime in on this too, because it seems the Japanese are thinking about it almost as a given as well, that the US is potentially going to decline, and they find themselves sitting, in the A2AD bubble of a rising China. So the question is, what can we do about that? Should we be more ambitious here? Should we be thinking about an Australian national security strategy where we say something like, Australia's national goal for the 21st century should be to prevent a war between the US and China. And this is how we should structure and organize a national security strategy to do that. So John, do you want to start? And then I might throw to Aurelia when you're ready.
Yeah, very briefly, yes. I think, I understand it's hard because Australia is a middle power and the U.S. China is a great power. There will be argument that Australia can do little and to shape the dynamics between U.S. and China. And also because there are structural reasons in addition to the different clashes of value between the two countries, there are structural reasons between the rising power and the dominant power. And so the conflict is perhaps inevitable. I think they are valid argument, but having said that, given the high stake that Australia has, and also the high impact of U.S.-China confrontation, and on Australia's national interest, and I think at least Australia should try, and there are various ways for Australia to try this. And the first thing is that Australia can actually work together with countries in the region. And exactly the countries in the region, when I talk about the countries in the region, I think when Australia defined and its immediate region and as Southeast Asia plus Southwest Pacific and Northeast Indian, then perhaps the countries within that region and what are their interests, what are their attitude towards the U.S.-China competition, what are their response to Australia's strategic update, and what Australia can do together with them and to achieve a desired end state of which in favor of Australia's national interest. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think Australia still has some leverage and also over both U.S. and China, because as a long-standing ally of United States, and also have a very strong trade relationship with China, and also actually recently the former Chinese ambassador to Australia, Fu Ying, actually made an interview and in which he highlighted Australia has an important role to play and in the future of regional security and stability. So that means regardless of the difference between Australia and China, and there are some fundamental difference in terms of value, in terms of interest, but that still be recognized, as I already said. And how does China see Australia? China does still see Australia as an important player in the region. So in that case, which means Australia's view still have some weight. That doesn't mean when Australia tries to shape the counter between US and China, that means Australia has to agree with but Australia can still at least consider to try and to do it.
Thanks for that, John. Aurelia, I'm going to give you the opportunity and to springboard off of what John just said, but also to answer one of the first questions from the broader audience. I want to frame this in the context of the Japanese idea of hedging strategy, where on the one hand, they're committed to the US alliance and trying to double down on that, but also taking action to hedge against the potential US decline. And the question from the audience is, where do you see the US-Australia relationship going over the next 10 to 20 years? Is Australia likely to move toward a closer relationship with China? So that would kind of be a different form of hedging strategy, right? Sort of trying to position ourselves between the US and China, sort of Kevin Rudd style, rather than in a hedging strategy as the Japanese have thought about. Can I ask you to give the Japanese perspective and perhaps expand?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, from the perspective of one of the candidates in the recent Japanese prime ministerial election and a possible future Japanese prime minister and former defense minister, Shigeru Ishiba, whom I think I mentioned to you before, Australia is seen as a potentially key member of an East Asian version of a NATO alliance NATO-like alliance mechanism, which would upscale strategic partnerships, the sort of relationship that we have at the moment, to something approximating a military alliance committed to collective defence in the extreme case. But Prime Minister Suga has shown no interest in the concept. Ishiba is a political rival, so Suga is not about to promote any of his ideas. And nor does strategic geography in the Indo-Pacific support such a proposition, according to Paul Dibb. I'm not sure whether Hugh White quotes Paul Dibb, but it's certainly relevant to his discussion in today's Canberra Times. But Suga is pushing his own watered-down version, and his priority list for telephone diplomacy, when he was newly elected as Prime Minister, Morrison was number one. I don't know whether people realise this. Scott Morrison was number one before Donald Trump, and then Prime Minister Modi, so they were 1 and 2. Morrison was 1 and Trump was 2, and then Prime Minister Modi came in before Xi Jinping at 6th and 7th. And that's been interpreted as quite revealing. It seems to show that Suga was signalling a willingness to work closely with Japan's Quad partners. And as you know, there's been recently, last week, a meeting of Quad partners in Tokyo as a number-1 priority. And one Japanese commentator has referred to Japan's relations with India and Australia as a quasi-alliance, given the levels of military-to-military and security cooperation. For example, Japan has acquisition and cross-servicing agreements with all 3 Quad partners. And Mike Pompeo's remarks on his recent Quad visit to Japan was certainly pushing this idea very strongly. They point to a US interest in creating a quasi-alliance structure beyond the periodic meetings of the Quad ministers. So there is movement in that direction. How long it will take and the pace of commitment of each of the partners is unknown at the present time, but certainly the United States is leading from the front, suggesting a commitment to greater engagement rather than withdrawal.
But I think there's a key question here about whether it's engagement under a US umbrella or engagement under our own terms in the sort of, gathering together a group of middle powers as we did in the response to COVID. I want to come to Jim Goldrick with the next question. I think anybody could answer it, but I think it's particularly suited to him. The question of, doesn't the framing of the problem here as a US China contest ignore the fact that Australia itself is fundamentally opposed to the strategic objectives of the Chinese Communist Party as distinct from China? Do we really have the option to hedge, or in fact, are we already committed just by the nature of having such very, very different goals and values to Beijing? I might ask you for your thoughts on that initially and then throw it open to the panel.
I think that's a real dilemma, because it's interesting how there's been an increasing perception that it's the way in which the objectives, there's a new perception of understanding of what the objectives are of the Chinese Communist Party, which do seem to affect us in a way that purely the survival of the Chinese Communist Party at a time of a rising China didn't. We sort of had a view that we could accept that was China doing its own thing. I think while China is behaving in the way it has very recently, while that continues, I think we are in a situation where we cannot ignore that. But I could definitely see a situation where if the Chinese were to step back and behave rather more in the way they had up to about 10 years ago,
2012, 2013.
I think then that there could very much be a modus vivendi. I mean, arguably that's an appeasement argument, but I do think that that's probably reflecting some reality and certainly would reflect the attitude of the Southeast Asian countries. I mean, I've been surprised at how badly China's behaved and how it does. I think they might have realised in the last couple of months, and I'd be very interested in John's comments, in the last few months that their bad behaviour has actually had largely negative effects for them. So I think whether we could, have a middling role with other powers, I think does depend very much on how China is behaving.
That's a great point. John or JB, or would anybody else like to chime in on this question?
I think that's a good point, and also I think that's a good question. And I actually have a similar meaning when I read that framing the fundamental problem as a U.S. China competition actually ignore the two important issues. I guess the defense word, but I'm not sure whether it's a diplomatic document or it's a real defense planning document. I think it's more productive by making it clear and at least and make it more specifically a list of Chinese activity which undermining Australia's national interest in what way and how should Australia to respond. But also that also means by framing that the driver as U.S. China competition also missed the opportunity by listing some of the actually the behavior of the United States, which are not necessarily in Australia's interest as well. I would see a good opportunity missed here is that a list and analysis of a number of activities of both great power, but mostly on China, and to see how exactly all this activity undermining the regional stability and peace, rather than categorize them in a politically neutral term, U.S. China competition. I think that's a good point, yes.
That's an interesting point. So I know Cheryl's got a comment, and I might throw this one to both Cheryl and to John. And this is our last question from the audience. So I'll get you to answer this, but also make any other comments you'd like to make. And I promised I wouldn't out any of the questioners. So anonymously, someone asks, it's been noted that every time the PM has a week of looking impotent with respect to the pandemic, the government makes a statement posturing against China. And the bluster seems to be, both politically motivated and possibly unnecessarily dangerous from a distance. So, one question is, okay, government's talking tough, but are they actually doing the behind the scenes things that need to be done here? And secondly, is there a role for the national security community in calling out that kind of behavior? So Cheryl and JB, I don't know who wants to go first on that one.
Well, I'll kick off. So I agree completely. I think a lot of the statements on China, indeed the timing of the strategic update, are time for domestic audiences. And we might also ask that same question about China's actions. How much of China's actions are also framed to domestic audiences? And I think given we sort of proposing a world which we have grey zone warfare, a less black and white view of everything would be helpful. And so certainly one of the, just following on the previous question, we need to sort of think about different frames for global relations. And certainly one that is emerging recently is a possible rapprochement between Europe and China, who had been driven apart by China's actions over the last 2 years from a quite close position prior to that. Yeah. And with America on board, if we do have a relatively seamless transition to a Biden government, which could happen or could quite possibly not happen, we have some consensus on global action towards climate change and energy shift, and that's quite a big one. So there's opportunities here to use those common grounds that China has with Europe and potentially with America to move forward in a more collaborative way and pick up what Jean's saying about have some idea of the shape we want for the future rather than...
So there's cooperation as well as competition.
Rather than frame it as a Thucydides trap, which we will inevitably spring.
Yeah, great point. JB, would you like to comment?
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is if you compare the strategic sort of think tank environment or the commentators in Australia to the US, we're so much smaller. Very few of the military, for example, when they retire, get out and actually participate in it. So there's something in our culture here which is we don't have a rigorous debate about these issues. Secondly, I think the most important thing is we've got to get real. What, we're 25, 27 million people. Yes, we've got a relative economic strength, but if you do any forward projection, prior to pandemics, but when you look at globally where we're going in terms of our economic strength and population size, about time to get real. And the important thing there is there's no point hiding behind, the big tough guy and yelling around the side of their legs at the Chinese. let's face reality. In terms of trade, there's been some interesting things written. We are the most dependent of all Five Eyes on China in terms of critical imports for critical areas. So let's face reality, and the market by itself is not going to take us into a secure or balanced position between economy and security. So one, face reality. Secondly, identify those areas where that interaction with countries like China, who we will not trust and will not trust in the future, where we can trade to mutual benefit, but it doesn't give us a security problem. We failed to do that. After that, learn when to keep our bloody mouth shut. We are small, and we've gone and bought 200 long-range missiles. ASPI came out with this analysis. Just work out, with the number of tankers we've got and the number of F-18 Super Hornet crews, how many of those missiles could you get out there and actually fire? Okay, so let's stop kidding ourselves. 72 or whatever, 75, whatever JSS does not mean that you can get all those airplanes airborne at once. 200 missiles doesn't mean you're going to have that effect. So let's take a Bex and have a lie down for the older generation and just say a reality picture on ourselves, a reality of what our real area is. Yes, we have to work with regional players, but I mean, if the Kiwis started carrying on like this, we'd tell them to pull their head in and say, yeah, who do you think you are, you little whatevers? We've got to face reality, I think.
Well, they held us to a draw in the Bledisloe yesterday over the weekend, so they're obviously a rugby superpower, if nothing else.
Now that's a real security issue.
Yeah, we're out of time. Before we sign off, though, I'd like to offer Commodore Levy any opportunity if you want to make any final remarks, Pete.
Oh, just to thank everybody, all the panelists for the discussion today. It's quite lovely, some really great points raised there. So thank you all for your time. Thank you all for the participants online and the questions as well. I know we didn't get through all of them, but thank you for that. And finally, Dave, to yourself for moderating and keeping everybody on track. Well done. I think it was a great forum. It's an important topic and the debate needs to continue. So thank you all for everybody's involvement.
Thank you. And while we're thanking people, I'd like to thank our events team here at UNSW Canberra who put this together online. I'd like to thank Asima Rabbani and Jenna Allen from our team in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences who pulled this together in a very well-managed way. Thank you to the panelists for those really outstanding insights and back and forth. And thank you to all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next time.